everyone. I am here with Samantha Dover, who is a child psychologist and a grief recovery specialist. She is also an instructor with the Institute of Child Psychology and teaches our grief and loss course. Hi, Sam. Nice to see you.
Hi, so good to see you. Thanks for having me here, Tammy.
Thanks. Yeah, so this has come up a lot in our clinical practice, and we've had some tragedies in our community. And because of that, I wanted to do a segment on grief and loss, and who better than to speak with than our grief specialist. So I was just, we spoke, and I was hoping you could just share some tips. I know grief can look different. It's not just about death. I think people think grief, they think death, but grief comes in many forms. As we've learned with COVID, we grieve
hmm
loss of jobs and divorce and separation and death of a pet, death of a loved one. There's lots of different types of grief, but if we're being a little more global, what would you say are some ways to get parents or caregivers started on that?
Great, thank you. Um, I think you're really hitting the nail on the head by naming it the way you have, and that my first tip for dealing with grief is really understanding what it is we're dealing with. Because when we bring up the topic of grief, a lot of times we go back to these old myths that have been ingrained with us about what grief actually means. So we'll hear things like, well, grief is the response to death, or grief are the feelings that come after a divorce. But we're not naming things like grief actually comes alongside the death of a pet, or grief comes alongside switching schools or moving houses, or not being able to see your friends or participate in soccer or whatever. Grief is conflicting feelings that come whenever there's a change in a familiar pattern around us. So, as soon as our children start experiencing the changes that are occurring in the world, it's normal for them to have a variety of emotions.
Yeah.
So, understanding all of that, I think, really sets the foundation for us to be prepared to respond to it. So, alongside understanding it, we want to know again, it's the conflicting feelings that come about because of a change, but we also want to know that a lot of our old methods for dealing with grief aren't necessarily the best way for responding to our kids. So things like encouraging your kid to just take time or to be strong are really counterproductive for children learning how to actually navigate through those emotions. So instead, what I would endorse is that we talk about them. We spend some time understanding all of the different feelings that we're going through, and we recognize that it's not just time that heals things, it's our active encouragement and support around it.
Yeah.
So that's my first layer.
And I would say, would you agree that parents need to understand that the emotional experience isn't just sadness? That,
Yes.
yeah, that to expect a variety of emotions is important. I know all three of my kids grieve differently. One gets really angry, one cries a lot, and one gets really anxious. So we've had a pet die and have very different reactions from all three of our kids. Does not look the same.
Yeah, 100%. The same in adults. I think all of us are individuals, and so we have to expect all of us are going to have an individual response to a grieving situation. And yeah, again, you're completely right. There are some children where you're going to see what you would expect from typical sadness, the big tears and the heaving cries and the wanting to snuggle with mommy or daddy because they're just sad, and that's normal. Or you're going to have kids who have the big emotional angry outbursts, and that's normal. Or we have the kids where we tell them that something happens and they go, "Okay, can I go play now?" And that's normal.
Yeah.
Like all of our kids are going to respond in a different way. And I think it's important to acknowledge too that children in particular only have the cognitive capacity to sit with those big feelings for so long. So even if they are in the big teary response or the big angry response, that's not going to last forever. It's totally normal for them to have those emotional outbursts and then 20 minutes later be like, "Can we go to the park now?"
Mm.
Because they can only sit with it for so long.
Yeah, I think parents expect their kids to be sad all the time, and yeah, they're not. I mean, we can't do that all day. We would be a puddle on the floor. We can't grieve all day
Yes.
long.
Exactly. And so that kind of leads me into another one of the tips that I like to give when I talk about grief, and that's to still encourage your regular routines and to make time for joy and happiness throughout too, because we can't expect kids to just sit in sadness. It's normal for them to want to still play with their friends or to still have movie nights or to do other things to express other emotions. And it's okay for us to keep that in their regular schedules too.
Yeah, we had our kids had lost a pet this week, and it's a very dear pet to them. And after the tears and the anger, I mean, those still will come up. The waves do get smaller, though. We went out for dinner and celebrated the pet, and the kids looked at me like, "We're celebrating he died?" And I said, "No, we're celebrating the life he lived." And we shared
Yeah.
stories about him, and it was just leaving space for there to be not just sad, that it's, just a way to facilitate that was important for our kids to see.
Yes, and I'm so glad you brought that up too, because that does lead into another tip that I wanted to cover. And that's the idea of developing and forming these rituals to celebrate the relationships we had. So,
Beautiful.
whether that's we go out for dinner once a year to talk about our pet and all of the memories we had about them, or one of the ones I see really commonly in at least our Western culture is having ornaments for the Christmas tree. So
Mm,
every year when we start decorating the Christmas tree, we bring out this ornament and it reminds us and prompts us to talk about those relationships that we love and that we miss. Or maybe it's a special meal that you cook that reminds you of someone. Or maybe you bring out an old scrapbook from when you went to a certain school. But all of these little rituals we can incorporate into our daily lives to remind us about how special that relationship was.
beautiful. Love it. Awesome.
Yeah. Um, and then I think one of the other things that's really important to cover when we talk about grief is the idea that as caregivers, it's really important for us to acknowledge what we're carrying and what we're feeling so that we can actually make the space to sit with our kiddos.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes, well, I shouldn't even say oftentimes, most of the time, we are their role models. And so if they see us trying to bury all of our emotions or believing that it makes us weak or that we shouldn't be sharing all of this, they're going to start to mimic that too. So it's important for us to acknowledge to our kids, like, yeah, this is hard. I get sad sometimes. I really miss that pet that we lost.
Mhm.
He or she was important to me.
Yeah.
And I think that really sets the stage for us to have some of these conversations.
Yeah, like giving this example of the pet, I had taken the pet to be put down because it was in a lot of pain. And of course, I'm crying and a mess in the morning. But by the time I got home, it's 7 o'clock at night and we go to bury him. And I'm kind of tapped out at this point. But
Yeah.
it was very upsetting to my 13-year-old that I wasn't crying and everyone else was. So I was had to really tap back into that pain, even though I was drained, because it was so important for
Totally.
her that I cry with them. And I was like, oh my goodness, like, oh, this is like, because it didn't fit for her that I wouldn't be crying when they were. So I think
Right.
that really highlights that, is that joint processing that kids want to see. They want to see you join them in that. But I think sometimes parents want to protect their kids. They don't want to seem weak because they want to be strong for their child. But we have to be vulnerable together. We have to take them sometimes into that place by leading them there ourselves, which is scary for
Right.
us as adults
It's
too.
terrifying. It's
Yeah.
so scary. And I cannot tell you how many amazing, strong, beautiful humans have brought their children to me going, Sam, can you work with this kid? They're grieving. And I say, okay, and what have you done for you? And they're like, nothing, because I need to know my kids better first.
Yeah.
And I say, okay, like I can completely honor your bravery, but you're only sitting with a therapist for an hour a week, and your kid goes home to you the rest of the time. So we need to make sure that you are good and that we can handle all those big feelings that you're going through because really your child gets the most healing from you.
Yeah. We all have to this the system has to be healthy.
Exactly.
Beautiful. Well, thank you, Sam, so much for taking the time to speak to me this morning. I'm excited to share this with all of our viewers. So hopefully
Yeah.
they'll get a chance to take your course, or at least just take some tips today from you on how to get their children through this.
Yeah. Thank you so much for letting me chat with everyone. And to everybody listening, good luck. You have lots of support. We're here for you if you need it.